On Christmas Day 1995, a legend died quietly. But the real shock came after the funeral. Dean Martin left behind more than hit songs and Hollywood memories. He left a fortune, a will, and 8 children who would discover just how differently their father had loved them. What looked like a simple inheritance became a final judgment, dividing siblings, assigning power, and exposing decades of silence, distance, and unspoken resentment. Why did one daughter inherit control of his legacy? Why did others walk away with less and no answers? And what tragedy changed Dean Martin forever, shaping the choices he made at the end of his life? This isn't just a story about money, but about absence, favoritism, and truth revealed. The Christmas that changed everything. On Christmas Day 1995, the world lost Dean Martin, but his family lost something far more complicated than a father. At 78 years old, Dean died quietly in his Beverly Hills home, surrounded not by loved ones, but by silence. A housekeeper discovered him that morning. No children, no final conversations, no goodbyes. For a man that had spent decades commanding stages, filling rooms with laughter, and defining what effortless cool looked like, his final moments were hauntingly empty. But the real shock didn't come from the way he died, it came from what he left behind. When his 8 children gathered in the weeks that followed to settle his estate, they expected closure. What they received instead was a confirmation of a truth they had lived their entire lives with, but never wanted to face. Dean Martin had kept score. The fortune he left behind, valued at more than $30 million, wasn't divided equally. It wasn't even divided gently. It was structured with precision, intention, and emotional weight. Some children walked away with power and control. Others received money with limits, conditions, or quiet dismissals written into legal language. The will wasn't just a final document, it was a judgment. It told each child exactly where they stood in their father's life. And what made it devastating wasn't a surprise. The children who received the least had long known Dean's distance. The ones who received the most had spent years fighting to stay close to him. The tragedy wasn't the division, it was the confirmation that love, in Dean Martin's world, had never been equal. This was not just a story about money, it was the story of a family fractured long before the will made it official. A man with 3 families, not one. To understand why Dean Martin divided his fortune the way he did, you have to understand one brutal reality. He didn't have a single family, he had 3. 3 wives, 8 children, and decades of relationships that never truly overlapped. His first marriage to Betty McDonald in 1941 began before fame found him. Back then, he was still Dino Crocetti, a struggling nightclub singer chasing opportunity. Betty believed in him when almost no one else did. Together, they had 4 children: Craig, Claudia, Gail, and Dina. But when Dean's career exploded through his partnership with Jerry Lewis, everything changed. Fame didn't just elevate him, it pulled him away. By 1949, the marriage collapsed. Betty was left raising 4 children, while Dean stepped into a glamorous new life. Weekend visits replaced daily presence. Phone calls replaced parenting. And gradually, even those faded. His second marriage to Jeanne Biger created an entirely different household. This was Dean Martin at the height of his powers. Mansions, Hollywood parties, the Rat Pack. With Jean, he had 3 more children: Dean Paul, Richie, and Gina, who grew up surrounded by wealth and celebrity. Yet even here, emotional distance remained. Dean was physically present, but unreachable, more icon than father. His third marriage to Catherine Hahn added an adopted daughter, Sasha, to the family. It lasted only 3 years, but Sasha remained legally his child. By the end of his life, Dean Martin had 8 children who shared his name but not his experience. Different mothers, different homes, different versions of the same man. The children he left behind first. For Dean Martin's first 4 children, childhood was defined by absence. After Betty McDonald's divorce, Craig, Claudia, Gail, and Dina grew up watching their father become a legend from a distance. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't violent, he simply wasn't there. Visits were irregular and often awkward. They didn't feel like time with a parent, they felt like appointments. Craig, the eldest, remembered waiting hours in lavish living rooms for a father who might never come home from work. Claudia stopped asking to visit altogether by her early teens, choosing disappointment avoidance over hope. Gail kept trying but always seemed she was interrupting a life already in motion. Only Dina refused to disappear quietly. She called constantly. She showed up unannounced. She demanded space in a life that seemed determined to move on without her. To Dean, these children represented a painful contradiction. They were part of his past, a reminder of these sacrifices fame had demanded. He provided financially, but emotionally he kept his distance, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of avoidance. The children grew up fast, learning independence not by choice but by necessity. They built lives without expecting guidance, affection, or consistency from their father, and that shaped them permanently. By adulthood, they no longer believed Dean would change. They didn't expect apologies or confessions. They didn't wait for emotional repair. They survived without him. And unknowingly, that independence would later become a deciding factor in how Dean judged them when he structured his estate. What they saw as self-protection, he would interpret as emotional distance. Long before lawyers entered the picture, the lines had already been drawn. Fame, wealth, and a different kind of distance. Dean Martin's second family lived inside the spotlight, but they weren't immune to his emotional absence. With Gene Biger, Dean entered his golden era. Las Vegas residencies, television dominance, Rat Pack immortality. Their children, Dean Paul, Richie, and Gina, grew up in Beverly Hills mansions where Frank Sinatra was a regular dinner guest and success felt normal. Proximity didn't mean closeness. Dean worked constantly. Nights belonged to casinos and stages. Days were for sleep, golf, and meetings. Family life existed in the margins. Dino Jr., the eldest of this group, tried hardest to bridge the gap. He followed his father into entertainment, chasing approval through performance. He wanted acknowledgement, pride, and connection. Richie and Gina adapted differently. They learned early not to expect emotional intimacy. They enjoyed the privileges but accepted the distance. Their father wasn't unkind, just unreachable. The third family, created through Dean's brief marriage to Catherine Hahn, was the most fragile of all. Sasha, his adopted daughter, never fully integrated into the larger Martin dynamic. When the marriage ended, Dean made the unexpected choice to keep her legally as his child. Yet their bond remained limited. She belonged to the family by law, not by history. By the time Dean reached his final years, he was surrounded by children who knew him in radically different ways. Some saw him as an absent provider, some as a charming stranger, as the father she refused to give up on, and one as a man who passed briefly through her life. These unequal relationships weren't accidents. They were the result of choices repeated over decades. And when Dean began planning his legacy, he didn't ignore these differences. He memorialized the empire built in the background. While Dean Martin's children learned to live without him, Dean was quietly building an empire few truly understood. To the public, he looked effortless, almost careless, a man with a drink in his hand, coasting on charm. But behind that image was a sharp, disciplined businessman who never stopped thinking long-term. During the 1950s and 60s, when most entertainers were content collecting paychecks, Dean focused on ownership. He formed his own production company, Claude Productions, ensuring he owned the television content rather than renting his talent to networks. Every rerun, every syndication deal, every future platform would send money back to him. In Las Vegas, he negotiated equity rather than upfront cash, taking ownership stakes in casinos as others mocked the decision. Those small percentages became massive payouts decades later. He did the same with music, securing publishing rights and catalog control while peers signed them away. Dean Martin wasn't reckless with money, he was methodical, and he believed deeply that this financial security would compensate for what he failed to provide emotionally. The tragedy was that he never explained this to his children. They saw missed birthdays, forgotten holidays, and emotional silence. They didn't see contract negotiations, investment meetings, or estate planning sessions. They didn't know that every absence was, in his mind, an act of provision. Dean believed money could protect his children from the instability he'd grown up with in Steubenville, Ohio. What he never understood was that security without presence feels like abandonment. The fortune grew, the distance grew faster. And by the time Dean realized the gap couldn't be closed with money, it was already too late to fix. The son who reached him. Among Dean Martin's 8 children, one relationship stood apart. Dean Paul Martin, known as Dino Jr., wasn't just his son, he was his mirror. Dino inherited his father's looks, charm, and natural ease with people. More importantly, he inherited the desire for connection. Dino didn't resent his father's absences the way others did. He forgave them. He pursued him. He followed him into entertainment, forming a band, acting on television, and carving out his own identity while still carrying the Martin name. But Dino wasn't only chasing fame. He joined the Air National Guard, becoming a fighter pilot, seeking discipline and purpose beyond celebrity. Dean admired this more than he ever admitted. Dino was the child he spoke about proudly, the one whose calls he took, the one who could make him laugh even in his darkest moods. For Dean, Dino represented redemption, the idea that something good had survived despite all his mistakes. On March 21, 1987, that illusion shattered. Dino's F-4 Phantom jet crashed during a training mission in California. He was 35. Dean was on tour when he received the news. Hours before showtime in Las Vegas, he learned his son was missing. Search teams were scrambling. Hope still existed. And yet, Dean went on stage. He performed the entire show, smiling, joking, singing, while his world collapsed internally. When the curtain closed, something inside him broke permanently. Dino's death wasn't just grief, it was punishment. It forced Dean to confront the child he loved most, and the love he hadn't given equally. The man who disappeared. After Dino Jr.'s death, Dean Martin vanished without leaving. He quit performing almost overnight, walking away from millions in guaranteed income. The Rat Pack reunion tour collapsed, appearances stopped, interviews ended. Dean retreated into his Beverly Hills home and rarely emerged. Days blurred into each other. He watched old movies, smoked endlessly, barely ate, and spoke to almost no one. The housekeeper became his gatekeeper, turning away visitors and fielding calls from confused, worried children. Some tried harder than others. Dina showed up repeatedly, refusing to accept silence as an answer. She sat with him, watched television, and existed in the same space without demanding anything. Craig called, but rarely got through. Others attempted visits once or twice, but stopped after being rejected. Everyone responded differently, but the result was the same. Dean was alone by choice. Inside that isolation, guilt consumed him. He blamed himself for Dino's death, not rationally, but emotionally. He believed his absences, his pressure, and his failures as a father had shaped his son's path. Losing Dino forced Dean to confront a truth he'd avoided his entire life. Love had not been equal, and neither had effort. For 8 years, he lived in this suspended state, neither fully alive nor gone. But he was thinking, he was reviewing, he was measuring relationships with brutal honesty. And during those silent years, Dean Martin made decisions that would speak louder than any confession ever could. He began reshaping his estate, not to heal wounds, but to reflect them accurately. The man who avoided confrontation in life was preparing one final, unavoidable statement in death. A will written with intent. By the time Dean Martin died in December 1995, his will was no afterthought. It was deliberate, layered, and emotionally precise. He didn't create a simple division of assets. He established the Dean Martin Family Trust, a complex structure designed to distribute money, power, and control among the children differently. When the 8 children gathered in a Beverly Hills law office weeks later, they expected formality. They did not expect judgment. The estate was valued at approximately $30 million, including real estate, music royalties, television rights, casino equity, and investments built over decades. But the numbers were secondary. What mattered was how the assets were assigned. Some children received lump sums, generous but finite. Others received lifelong trusts with conditions. And one child received something far more significant, authority. Dina Martin, the daughter who never stopped showing up, was named co-executor and given control over Dean's image, licensing rights, and legacy decisions. She didn't just inherit wealth, she inherited responsibility and power. Richie and Gina received comfortable trusts without control. Craig, Claudia, and Gail received smaller direct shares. Sasha received the most limited trust of all. The room went silent as the implications settled in. This wasn't about favoritism alone, it was about evaluation. Every phone call returned, every visit made. Every relationship maintained or abandoned had been tallied. Dean Martin had turned his estate into a final scorecard, and for the first time, his children were forced to confront how their father truly measured love, loyalty, and worth. The room where everything fell apart. When the attorney finished reading the will, no one spoke at first. The silence inside that Beverly Hills law office carried more weight than any argument ever could. 8 siblings sat together, yet emotionally scattered across decades of resentment, confusion, and confirmation. This wasn't grief that had already been exhausted at the funeral. This was something sharper, validation. For some, the will confirmed they had never imagined closeness where none existed. For others, it confirmed effort had been noticed, tracked, and rewarded. Craig Martin stood up without a word and walked out. He didn't need clarification. The document had explained his entire childhood in legal language. Claudia cried quietly, not from shock, but from the pain of seeing emotional truth reduced to a financial hierarchy. Gail stared ahead, numb, realizing that fairness had never been the goal. Dina, overwhelmed, asked to speak privately with the attorney. The weight of authority her father placed on her shoulders felt heavier than the money itself. Richie and Gina remained composed, understanding their position, but careful not to celebrate it. Sasha sat quietly, absorbing the realization that she had been acknowledged, but only barely. The will didn't start fights that day. It ended illusions. There would be no family unity forged through shared inheritance, no healing moment where siblings came together. They left separately, entered different cars, and returned to other lives. From that moment forward, the Martin family existed as a legal entity, not an emotional one. Dean Martin hadn't reunited them in death. He had frozen them in the positions they already occupied. The document didn't create division, it formalized it. Power is heavier than money. For Dina Martin, inheritance came with consequences no one else fully carried. Being named co-executor and guardian of Dean Martin's legacy was not simply an honor, it was a burden disguised as trust. She was now responsible for approving every licensing deal, every use of her father's name, image, and voice. She became the gatekeeper of memory itself. And while some siblings quietly accepted this, others struggled deeply with it. To them, it felt less like preservation and more like ownership. Dina threw herself into the role with relentless dedication. She toured performing her father's music, organized festivals in his hometown, and wrote a memoir portraying him as complicated but loving. To fans, it was devotion. To some siblings, it felt like revision. Conflicts emerged quietly at first. Requests for memorabilia, disagreements over how Dean should be portrayed, concerns about commercializing grief. But the trust documents were clear. Dina had final authority. Every disagreement ended the same way. Paperwork always won. Holidays became strained. Conversations grew guarded. Where there had once been emotional distance, there now was legal hierarchy. Dina wasn't just a sister anymore, she was management. And that changed everything. She felt guilty about benefiting more than others, yet also believed she had earned that role through persistence. Both could be true at once. Power, Dean had understood, reshapes relationships more permanently than money ever could. By giving Dina control rather than just wealth, he ensured the fracture would never fully heal. Authority creates resentment even where intention is pure. And from the moment she accepted her role, the family dynamic shifted beyond repair. The ones who walked away quietly. Not all of Dean Martin's children fought the will. Some accepted it with a quiet resignation shaped by years of emotional distance. Craig, Claudia, and Gail had long since learned how to live without their father's approval. Their inheritances, though smaller, were enough to secure comfortable lives. Comfort was never what they'd been seeking. What hurt was the message, the confirmation that, from their perspective, effort had never been measured fairly. They'd stopped trying, not out of indifference, but out of self-preservation. Craig avoided most public events tied to his father's legacy. When he did speak, he spoke carefully, refusing to participate in narratives that felt incomplete. Claudia withdrew from public discussion altogether. Gail focused on her own family, choosing privacy over conflict. Richie and Gina occupied an uneasy middle ground. They benefited from the trust without wielding authority, maintaining relationships with all sides without fully aligning with any. They attended some events, skipped others, and avoided public disputes. Sasha remained on the edges, present but never central, connected legally but emotionally detached. Over time, the family developed parallel lives, separate holidays, separate celebrations, separate versions of remembrance. There were no dramatic lawsuits or headline-grabbing feuds, just a quiet separation, the kind that feels permanent because no one's fighting anymore. Dean Martin's children did not break apart loudly. They faded from one another slowly, each choosing the version of peace they could tolerate. In that sense, the will succeeded exactly as written. It reflected reality rather than repairing it. The family didn't collapse. It simply accepted the shape it had always been in. A legacy turned into a business. As the years passed, Dean Martin's legacy grew more valuable than ever. Streaming platforms introduced his music to generations who never saw him live. His television appearances found new audiences. Merchandise, documentaries, and licensing opportunities multiplied. In 2023, a significant deal with a legacy management company expanded the commercial reach of his image and likeness. Financially, the estate flourished. Emotionally, the family grew further apart. To Dina, these deals were preservation. She believed that keeping her father visible would ensure he wouldn't fade into nostalgia. To some siblings, it felt like exploitation, turning private money into a public product. But the trust allowed no veto. Dean had anticipated disagreement and structured authority accordingly. This wasn't accidental, it was intentional containment. By centralizing control, he eliminated chaos while guaranteeing resentment. Fans saw a polished image of Dean Martin, warm, charming, timeless. Behind the scenes, his children continued negotiating what his life truly meant. Legacy, it turned out, was not just about remembrance, it was about ownership of truth. Each child held a different version of their father. The estate elevated one version above the rest. Money continued flowing, royalties accumulated, but emotional reconciliation never arrived. Dean Martin remained larger than life to the world and permanently distant within his own bloodline. The empire he built ensured financial security across generations. It did nothing to reunite the people he left behind. In that way, the legacy was perfectly consistent with the life he lived. The question no one asked aloud. As years passed, one question hovered over the Martin family without ever being spoken about directly. Did Dean Martin intend to hurt them? The easy answer would be yes. The honest answer is more uncomfortable. Dean didn't design his will to cause pain. He created it to tell the truth he never dared to speak. In life, he avoided confrontation. He deflected with humor, charm, and distance. In death, he chose precision. The unequal distribution wasn't emotionally cruel in his mind. It was accurate. He believed pretending all relationships were equal would be dishonest, and dishonesty to him felt worse than conflict. This belief shaped every clause of his estate plan. He rewarded persistence. He acknowledged distance. He accepted that some bonds had eroded beyond repair. For Dean, love was not a moral ideal. It was a lived experience, measured by grief, forgiveness, and proximity. He knew this approach would anger some and burden others, but he believed clarity was kinder than illusion. The tragedy is that his children were forced to receive that clarity without the chance to respond. There were no conversations, no explanations, no final apologies, just documents. Paper cannot soften truth, it can only record it. And so, the will became Dean Martin's final performance, controlled, deliberate, and emotionally detached. A confession delivered without vulnerability. His children weren't reacting to money. They were responding to the realization that their father had been evaluating them quietly for decades, not loving blindly and not forgiving equally, just measuring. And in that moment, they understood something essential. Dean Martin had loved them in different ways, and he had finally stopped pretending otherwise. Notes from a man preparing to leave. Years after Dean Martin's death, a revelation surfaced that reframed the entire story. During his final decade, Dean had kept personal notes while working with his attorney. These weren't legal explanations, they were reflections, private acknowledgments of failure, regret, and brutal honesty. About Dina, his words were unmistakable. She was the one who stayed, the one who refused to let him disappear completely. He believed she had earned authority not through obedience, but endurance. He trusted her to work tirelessly, perhaps excessively, to preserve his name. About Craig, Claudia, and Gail, his tone shifted. He admitted he had failed them first. He recognized that their independence was born from abandonment, and because they had learned to survive without him, he believed they didn't need his money to define their futures. He wasn't punishing them in his mind. He was acknowledging that he couldn't buy back lost years. For Richie and Gina, Dean expressed a different sadness. They had grown up with wealth but emotional distance. He wanted them protected but not dependent. Security without control. Sasha was the clearest of all. He took on his responsibilities as a father, but acknowledged that their bond had never truly formed. Her inheritance reflected that honesty. These notes revealed something devastating. Dean Martin was not confused when he wrote his will. He was painfully self-aware. The estate wasn't designed by indifference. It was created by reflection. And in those final years, alone in his thoughts, Dean decided honesty mattered more than harmony. The favorite he never denied. One truth cut through all of Dean Martin's reflections with painful clarity. Dino Jr.'s death didn't just break him, it clarified him. Losing the child he loved most forced Dean to confront something he had always known but never admitted. Love is not evenly distributed, and pretending otherwise would be his final lie. In his notes, Dean acknowledged Dino as the child he connected with most deeply, the one who forgave him, the one who bridged the distance instead of retreating from it. Dino's death stripped away denial. It left Dean alone with grief that was unmistakably different in intensity from anything he felt before. He wasn't ashamed of that difference anymore. He accepted it, and that acceptance shaped everything. The will became his way of refusing one last performance. No equal division, no symbolic fairness, just truth. The fortune reflected the relationships exactly as they existed. This wasn't generosity, it was an emotional accounting. Some children received more because they had invested more. Some received less because they had stepped back. Dean didn't consider the circumstances. He considered outcomes. It was flawed logic, but it was his. And in his mind, fairness was irrelevant. Honesty was the only standard that mattered. His children didn't lose a father in that moment. They lost the illusion that he had ever been capable of loving them the same way. Dino Jr.'s absence haunted every decision. Not because Dean wanted to replace him, but because losing him made pretending impossible. The truth had already destroyed him. The will simply documented the damage. 3 families, 3 truths. With time, it became clear that no single narrative could contain Dean Martin's legacy. Each family he created carried a different truth. To the children from his first marriage, he was absent, a man who chose fame over fatherhood and never fully returned. To the children from his second marriage, he was a presence without access, present, wealthy, and emotionally unavailable. To Sasha, he was an obligation fulfilled without intimacy. And to Dina, he was a man worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed unwinnable. None of these versions was wrong. They were incomplete fragments of the same man. Dean Martin was capable of warmth and neglect, generosity and avoidance, charm and cruelty without intent. His will did not create these realities. It simply aligned them with money and power. That alignment made the difference impossible to ignore. Over time, the siblings stopped trying to agree on who their father had been. They accepted that each had known a different man. The estate continued functioning. The legacy remained profitable. But the family existed in parallel timelines. There was no final reconciliation, no shared understanding, just coexistence at a distance. Dean Martin left behind wealth, music, and a carefully controlled image. What he could not leave behind was unity. And perhaps that was the most honest outcome of all. 3 families, 8 children, one legacy that meant something different to each of them. In the end, Dean Martin was precisely what his life suggested he was, beloved by millions, deeply flawed at home, and honest only when it no longer required courage. Holidays without a center. The first Christmas after Dean Martin's death was the last time all 8 children gathered in one place. It was awkward, restrained, and emotionally exhausting. But it happened. By the following year, fractures had already widened. By the turn of the millennium, there were separate celebrations, different houses, different guest lists, different memories being honored. The holidays exposed what the will had confirmed. There was no longer a shared emotional center holding the family together. Dina hosted gatherings tied to legacy events, often attended by Richie and Gina. Craig, Claudia, and Gail held quieter celebrations on their own, avoiding the spotlight entirely. Sasha moved between spaces, never fully belonging to any of them. These divisions weren't fueled by hatred, they were driven by incompatibility. Each group remembered a different father, and pretending otherwise felt dishonest. Over time, separation became routine rather than painful. The children stopped explaining absences, invitations became symbolic. The idea of family tradition dissolved into parallel customs. Publicly, Dean Martin remained synonymous with warmth and nostalgia. Privately, his name marked absence. The irony was impossible to miss. A man whose music defined togetherness had left behind a family incapable of gathering. But none of them blamed the will anymore. They blamed the years before it. The estate had simply drawn boundaries around emotional truths that already existed. The holidays no longer carried conflict. They carried acceptance. And that acceptance, though quiet, felt final. The silence that replaced conflict. By the second decade after Dean Martin's death, arguments faded. Not because wounds healed, but because exhaustion set in. The siblings stopped debating fairness. They stopped contesting authority. They stopped trying to connect one another's memories. Silence replaced confrontation. Craig rarely spoke publicly. When he did, his words were measured and detached. Claudia avoided interviews entirely. Gail focused inward, choosing family privacy over legacy involvement. Richie and Gina maintained polite neutrality, appearing when expected and disappearing when necessary. Dina continued working relentlessly, driven by purpose, loyalty, and a sense of obligation she never fully questioned. Sasha remained peripheral, protected from conflict by distance. What once felt raw now felt settled, not resolved, but fixed. The estate continued generating income, licensing deals expanded, the brand grew stronger. Emotionally, the family became static. There was no longer anger sharp enough to spark reconciliation, just differing versions of peace. Dean Martin's children had learned to live with the truth that the will delivered. Truth didn't soften with time, it simply became familiar. And familiarity, even with pain, reduces urgency. The silence that followed was not forgiveness, it was an adaptation. Each child adjusted their expectations of family until disappointment no longer surprised them. Dean had once avoided difficult conversations by withdrawing. In death, his children mirrored that behavior. They withdrew from one another rather than confront what couldn't be changed. The legacy survived, the family did too, just not together. A fortune that keeps growing. Financially, Dean Martin's foresight proved flawless. Decades after his death, his estate continued expanding. Streaming services revived his music for younger audiences. Television reruns found new platforms. Merchandising, licensing, and brand partnerships multiplied. The $30 million estate of 1995 quietly doubled, perhaps tripled. From a business perspective, Dean Martin's plan was a triumph. The trust structure protected assets, centralized decision-making, and prevented destructive infighting. There were no lawsuits, no public collapses, no erosion of value. Everything worked exactly as designed. But financial success highlighted emotional failure. The money ensured comfort, not connection. It provided stability without reconciliation. His children benefited materially, yet remained emotionally distant. Dean had succeeded in preserving his image while accepting the cost to his family, and perhaps that had always been the trade-off he was willing to make. His fortune did not unite his children, but it ensured they would never need one another to survive. Independence replaced interdependence. Each sibling could exist without compromise. That, too, reflected Dean's worldview. Self-sufficiency mattered more than emotional vulnerability. The estate became a monument to that belief. Profitable, efficient, isolated. Dean Martin's wealth outlived him comfortably. His relationships did not. And in the end, that imbalance defined everything he left behind. The lie he refused to tell. In the final analysis, Dean Martin's will revealed something few parents are willing to admit. Love is rarely equal. Relationships evolve unevenly. Effort matters. Dean refused to disguise those truths in death, even if he spent his life avoiding them in conversation. He chose honesty over comfort, documentation over dialogue, and that choice permanently reshaped his family. He could have divided everything equally and let his children argue privately about emotional distance. Instead, he codified difference. He made his judgment unavoidable. In doing so, he spared himself one final performance, the illusion of fairness. That decision was neither noble nor cruel. It was consistent. Dean Martin lived his life avoiding emotional exposure. His will allowed him to express truth without vulnerability. No confrontation, no tears, just structure. The cost of that decision was borne entirely by his children. They were forced to receive clarity without compassion, understanding without explanation. The will told them who he trusted, who he valued, and who he believed no longer needed him. It was devastating precisely because it felt accurate. Dean didn't divide his fortune to punish. He divided it to reflect the reality he saw. And truth, stripped of sentiment, is often harsh. In refusing to tell one last lie, Dean Martin ensured his legacy would be honest, profitable, and permanently incomplete. The truth survived. Unity did not. 8 children, 8 memories. With time, each of Dean Martin's children settled into a private understanding of who their father had been. Not the public icon, not the myth, the man. Craig remembered waiting. Claudia remembered disappointment. Gail remembered learning independence early. Richie remembered a charming presence that never fully arrived. Gina remembered comfort paired with emotional quiet. Sasha remembered a brief inclusion without roots. Dina remembered persistence, rejection, and devotion rewarded too late. None of these memories contradicted one another. They simply described different moments of the same life. The mistake outsiders often make is assuming one version must be correct. In truth, Dean Martin contained all of them. His legacy fractured not because his children disagreed, but because their experiences never overlapped. The will did not erase those differences, it validated them. Over time, the siblings stopped arguing about the past. They accepted that memory is shaped by proximity and need. The man who felt distant to one child felt unreachable to another and worth fighting for a third. Dean's fortune provided a shared origin story, but not a shared emotional language. The inheritance didn't bind them, it clarified separation. And perhaps that clarity, painful as it was, allowed each child to stop chasing a version of fatherhood that never existed. They no longer waited for acknowledgement that would never come. They carried forward their own truth, unchallenged and unshared. In that sense, Dean Martin's children reached peace, not through reconciliation, but through acceptance. Acceptance that family does not always mean unity. Sometimes it simply means shared history, carried alone. The image the world chose to keep. To the public, Dean Martin remains the epitome of effortless charm. The crooner with a grin, the relaxed performer with a glass in his hand, the voice that made loneliness sound romantic. That image has endured precisely because it avoids complexity. Fans don't see fractured families or unanswered phone calls. They hear music that feels warm and inclusive. The estate, carefully managed, reinforces that image. Licensing deals highlight nostalgia. Performances celebrate joy. Documentaries emphasize humor and talent. There's nothing false about this portrayal. It's simply incomplete. Dean Martin understood branding long before it became a concept. He curated distance in life and consistency in image. His will ensured that control would continue after his death. The world receives a version of Dean Martin that's comforting, familiar, and undemanding. His children live with a heavier, unresolved version. Both can exist at once. Legacy does not require full truth to function. It requires coherence, and coherence was something Dean valued deeply. The irony is unavoidable. A man whose music brought people together left behind a family permanently apart. Yet his audience never needed to know that. His songs did their job. They still do. The image survives because it was designed to. And perhaps that was Dean Martin's most tremendous success. Not fame, not fortune, but control over how he would be remembered. Was it fair or was it honest? Fairness implies equality. Honesty implies accuracy. Dean Martin chose the latter. Whether that choice was right depends entirely on perspective. To some of his children, the will felt like punishment for survival. To others, it felt like recognition for endurance. To Dean, it was alignment. He matched outcomes to relationships without softening the result. There was no attempt to balance emotional harm with financial compensation. He didn't try to heal wounds he believed were beyond repair. He documented them. That decision stripped away comforting myths about parental love. It forced his children to accept that affection. Effort and forgiveness are not evenly distributed. Dean's estate planning wasn't compassionate, it was consistent. And consistency was the value he trusted most. The tragedy is that his children had no opportunity to negotiate meaning with him. They were left to interpret intention alone. Some found clarity. Some found bitterness. Most found a mix of both. Fairness might have produced temporary peace. Honesty produced permanent understanding. Dean Martin chose the option that required the least emotional exposure from himself. Even in death, he avoided vulnerability. That avoidance cost him unity, but preserved control. Whether that trade was worth it is a question only his children can answer, and none of them answers it the same way. What Dean Martin never fixed. Dean Martin built an empire. He secured generational wealth. He preserved his image. What he never fixed was absence. Money could not rewrite missed childhoods. Trust documents could not replace conversation. Authority could not create intimacy. Dean's children learned this lesson individually and early. They confirmed it collectively. He succeeded as a provider and failed as a presence. And in his final years, he knew it. His notes revealed regret, but not repentance, understanding, but not repairing. He accepted the shape of his life rather than attempting to change it. That acceptance informed every decision he made at the end. Dean Martin did not seek forgiveness. He sought accuracy. And accuracy came at a cost he was no longer alive to pay. His children inherited both the benefit and the burden of his choices. Financial security paired with emotional finality. No loose ends. No unresolved ambiguity. Just a clear message delivered too late for dialogue. In that sense, Dean Martin's most significant flaw followed him into death. He avoided the most challenging work of all, emotional repair, because it required presence rather than planning. His will closed accounts. It did not close wounds, and those wounds shaped everything that followed. The truth that remains. In the end, Dean Martin left behind exactly what his life suggested he would. Fortune carefully constructed. A legacy meticulously controlled. Family permanently divided. He did not create those divisions in death. He revealed them. The will didn't fracture the family. It confirmed fractures that had existed for decades. 8 children, 3 families, 1 man who loved imperfectly and honestly only when honesty no longer demanded courage. Millions adored Dean Martin and were deeply complicated at home. He chose success over presence, control over vulnerability, and accuracy over comfort. His children live with the consequences of those choices every day. Some found peace, some found distance, none found unity, and perhaps that's the most honest ending possible. Dean Martin's story was never about balance. It was about trade-offs: fame for intimacy, wealth for warmth, honesty for harmony. The world remembers his voice. His family remembers his absence. Both memories are true, and together they form a complete picture of a man who made people feel less alone while leaving his own children to navigate life on their own. That was Dean Martin, cool to the world, distant from his family, honest in death, even when honesty hurt. If you've watched the video till here, that means you've enjoyed the video. Subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notifications bell icon